Good evening. It is now 5:32 p.m. I hereby call this meeting to order. Note that we have the presence of a quorum, that the meeting has been duly called, and that notice of the meeting has been posted for the time and manner required by law. Up first on our agenda, we have the 2018-19 budget and proposed tax rates.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. This is our annual meeting where the budget team kind of prepares and presents the public meeting, after which the board will hear public comment. So I'm going to turn it right over to Stephen Bassett, our CFO, to kind of introduce the presentation. Steve?
Thank you, Dr. Dupree, Madam Vice President, members of the board. So today's the culmination of months of collaborative work done throughout the district to try to close the gap to bring a budget to the board. We're not completely balanced, but we're very close and not dipping too far into our economic stabilization fund. I'm going to turn the presentation over to Brian, and he'll be able to walk you through the slides.
Good evening, Madam Vice President and members of the board, Dr. Dupree. The purpose of the meeting this evening is twofold. First, we'll be reviewing with you the proposed budget for 2018-19, as well as the tax rate that will support it. And then finally, we'll turn it back over to you, Madam Vice President, to conduct the public hearing on the budget. The proposed budget for the district has been prepared based on state statutory requirements. And my lightsaber is not working, so I'll use the keyboard. Based on state statutory requirements, I won't go through each of these individually, but I would highlight items number 3 and 4, which relate to the public notice requirements. The notice was published in 3 local newspapers as required by statute: the Fort Bend Star, Fort Bend Independent, and the Fort Bend Herald, 10 days prior to the meeting this evening, so we have met that requirement. In addition, the notice, along with the required budgetary information, which we included in your agenda packet, was posted on our website, also that is required by state statute. As a reminder, there are 3 funds that will be adopted by the board: the General Fund, the Debt Service Fund, and the Child Nutrition Fund. I'll be reviewing each of those with you this evening so that you have an idea of what's included in those as part of the proposed budget. The largest budget will be the General Fund budget, and the general operating budget for the district for 2018 and 19 is proposed at $634.6 million. That breaks down to expenditures of $8,360 per student on a projected enrollment of 75,909 students in daily average attendance. The daily enrollment information was provided by PASA, the district's demographer, and is based on their moderate growth scenario. Our assumptions for 2018-19 are listed here, and we are expecting average daily attendance of 96.5% based on the average daily membership of 75,909. We're using local property value growth of 3% and a CPTD growth of 6.8%. And as a reminder, the CPTD number is provided by the state controller, and it is based in January, and it's based on prior year growth. So this number is from the state and not a number that is calculated at the local level. Our WADA is projected to grow at 0.9% over the current year, and our free and reduced count is expected to be at 32,717, which will represent 43% of our student population being eligible for that benefit. There have been 2 adjustments made to revenues, and I believe we've shared both of these with you. The first one is related to our SPED participation, because we've seen increased participation in programs in special education. Our revenues there have increased by $2.4 million. That is included in the budget. And then we've increased the transfer from extended learning from $2 million to $2.5 million, so $500,000 in additional revenue to the general fund. Although there is not a general pay increase included in the budget, we have continued with the teacher STEP program, and that is at a cost of $2.6 million. So each teacher that is currently in place will receive a minimum of $500 as they move up the step for their as part of the teacher pay scale. The budget includes 214 new positions that are in the budget, and that's right at $13 million. Included in those positions are 46 new staff members for Thornton Middle School, 47 that are associated with the Early Literacy Center, 85 for special education, including 36 teachers, 29 for campus support, that also includes 25 teachers, and then 7 positions for the Reese CTE Center that will be the initial staffing that's required to begin operations of that center. Looking at the budget by functional area, 80% of our total will be in the instructional and instructional support areas at $389.4 million for instruction, $115.8 for instructional support. The remaining portion is for district operations, which is about 17% of the total budget, with central administration making up the remainder at $19.6 million or 3%. I'll point out in a few minutes how that or tie the budget to the goals, but one of the things I do want to mention is about 90% of the total budget that you see here is associated with salary and benefits for employees. So historically, that's been what our number has been. So as you look at these numbers, you'll have to consider that these will be the people who are directly responsible for implementing the board's goals and objectives. Of the $634.6 million, $505.2 million of that is going to be for instructional and instructional support, as I showed you just a moment ago. This is our core business and includes expenditures for teachers, principals, counselors, instructional staff, and materials and supplies for those particular areas. And you can see the individual functional areas here. I won't go through those individually, but I will mention that what we have done is we've gone through the budget, particularly in this area, and aligned the goals, aligned the expenditures with the goals that the board has set forth. Now, I will say that this exercise has been more of an art than a science, although there is some science to it, because we are not particularly at the point of doing a true zero-based budget where we tie every single expenditure to a goal or objective. But based on how we budget at the functional and programmatic level, we can show you how we are aligning the expenditures that we're making specifically with the goals and the objectives set out by the Board of Trustees. And as I go through this, I will say I have the cavalry here with me. Stephanie Williams, Troy Byrne will be able to assist as I go through these if you have specific questions about the expenditures that we're making at a programmatic level as they relate to the goals and objectives. As we look at District Goal 1 related to equitable learning environment, we're spending $423.3 million on this goal. About 60% of that is going to be tied up in teachers and classrooms aides, as well as school leadership, which would be the principals and the aides that assist them in their day-to-day tasks. So the first 2 items that you see on there are classroom teachers and principals associated with that. The next item that we have is the professional learning model at about $1.75 million for advancing the curriculum instruction throughout the district. Curriculum development, which is associated with putting together the curriculum that we teach to students each day, is at $10.37 million, and that breaks down into about $8.89 million for staffing, which is roughly 81 coordinators and specialists that assist with that, curriculum writing, and then distance learning that we have. So those items that you see that are sub-bullets under there are what make up those totals. The fine arts area, this is the teaching staff associated with the curriculum side of fine arts, not necessarily the extracurricular components, but that totals about $25.56 million. And then as we go through the instructional programming side, you can see the instructional leadership staff, which is going to be associated with the directors, executive directors, and coordinators who are responsible for putting together the actual programming that is implemented at the campus level. It includes the expenditures associated with the Early Literacy Center, as well as EDGE, the SPED and co-teaching components of our expenditures, the GT and academies, and then finally the bilingual and ESL programs that are implemented in the district. The final 2 items that are on here are academic intervention. These include expenditures associated with summer school, as well as the Student Success Initiative and end-of-year courses that are taught as part of continuing credits, and then the interventionists and specialists that are associated with providing support to students who are at risk. And then finally, the final component of this would be the campus budgets. These are the supplies and materials that the campuses need to operate. This is for all of our campuses and totals just under $10 million. And I guess the question I would ask here, do you all want me to go through each goal and then have questions at the end, or address the questions with each goal? With each goal? Okay. So I'll pause here and ask if there are any. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. For District Goal 2, this is to ensure that students own and are responsible for their learning and behavior and progress throughout the Fort Bend ISD curriculum. The expenditures budgeted associated with this goal total $11.36 million. The largest expenditure that we have are for the campus compliance coordinators and the campus assessment coordinators. That supports total positions of about 76 people, or 76 positions total. On the assessment framework, we have expenditures totaling about $4.71 million. This includes expenditures for assessment and accountability. That's 12 full-time employees who support that particular program. Renaissance 360, which is the district's, and I just completely lost what that is, universal screener. That's used for determining where students stand prior to actual taking testing. For post-secondary readiness, this includes 12 full-time employees as well as the associated operating expenditures to support that program. And then CTE certifications, which these are the actual certificates that students can learn that are professional level expenditure or professional level certificates, such as with Adobe and some of the other advanced programs that are out there. And then finally, related to the positive behavior and instructional support, we have about $900,000 budgeted, and this is for RTI aides, or response to intervention aides, and coordinators and facilitators. For District Goal 3, this is where the district will provide an inclusive, collaborative, and fluid learning environment and opportunities for risk-taking and success. The majority of expenditures that are associated with this at $26.34 million are associated with blended learning. That includes components of the CTE program, Project Lead the Way, robotics and coding, as well as Schoology, which is the district's platform for providing online learning or online instruction to students. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, part of our fine arts are also wrapped up in this. The extracurricular activities, however, include athletics, fine arts staff stipends, student travel, as well as the associated UIL fees for participating in that program, athletics equipment, athletics game officials, and then the campus and department supplies that are part of providing extracurricular activities. And then finally, the athletics district level staffing, including the district's, and I completely lost that one as well, the director of athletics. So these are the district level staffs associated with that. District Goal 4 is providing students for students' social, emotional, academic, literacy, and language needs, as well as life skills in a safe environment. The budgeted expenditures here total $44.2 million and include guidance counseling, the counseling staff that's throughout the district, Naviance, which is the district-level software for providing support to mostly secondary students, as well as the supplies and materials associated with that. For health services, we have a budget of $7.88 million. That includes nurses' aides, as well as all of the health supplies that are required to be purchased throughout the district to support those positions. Social work services are the social workers that provide direct support to students, as well as the contract that we have with Fort Bend County for truancy initiatives, which is an interlocal agreement that we have with the county. Our collaborative communities efforts, we have about $470,000 budgeted there. And then for the licensed school psychologists, about $2.78 million. And that's roughly 43 full-time employees that are included in that. And then finally, one of the final items that I'll mention is the ropes course that we have that's offered at the high school level that we provide that meets those goals and objectives. Transitioning away from the instructional side to the district operations, that represents about 17% of the total budget at $110 million. And this includes about 1,583 employees who manage the districts, including bus drivers, vehicle maintenance crews, custodial staff, police officers, crossing guards, and grounds and maintenance personnel. So this is one of the larger areas that we have outside of instruction. It also includes the utility costs, police services, building repairs, lawn maintenance, information technology expenditure, transportation costs, insurance costs, and the annual property appraisal services that are conducted by the central appraisal districts. And I guess if you wanted to look at this, this is what it takes to keep the lights on in the district, quite literally. And although most of these expenditures could be considered fixed costs, when we go through some of the cost savings that we've identified, you'll see that although they may be fixed, we do make efforts to try to keep these costs under control, as we do with all other expenditures. The final component of the budget is central administration expenditures, at just under $20 million, makes up about 3% of the budget. We have 165 total positions in central administration, which includes district leadership such as the superintendent and his executive team. In addition to that, includes all finance employees, accounting, accounts payable, budget, and purchasing. These employees are there to ensure that employees are paid in a timely manner, taxpayer funds are used in a responsible manner, and that the district meets all state reporting requirements. In addition to central administration, HR functions are included. And as you may have seen before, Fort Bend ISD is the largest employer in Fort Bend County. And with over 10,000 employees, there's definitely a workload associated with processing those employees in terms of handling the hiring of new teachers, processing retirements, and any resignations that occur. So these are the responsibilities that are wrapped up into the central administration area. Having talked through that, one of the things that would be worthy of pointing out is there was some recent information relieved from Texas Smart Schools. And as part of that information, this was a process or a website that was started by former State Controller Susan Combs, and it's been handed over to Texas A&M University, who now administers this. And as part of that, they released findings on cost-adjusted spending per pupil versus academic progress. And overall, the district scored very well with academic process higher than 91% of the other districts. So if you look at this particular quadrant here, you can see that we are in the upper right-hand quadrant, which means that we have high academic progress. And then looking across the bottom, you'll notice that the expenditures work in a reverse pattern here. So our academic expenditures related to our peers is actually lower. And then our students per spending, our expenditure per pupil at $7,785 is less than most other large districts that are comparable to us. So that resulted in an overall SMART score of 4.5 stars, which is out of a total of 5. So that's a very good progress as we see as we align our expenditures to how we manage the budget. I mentioned a few minutes ago some of the budget reduction efforts that have been undertaken at the district level. We've reviewed these with you in some prior workshops. The first item on here, utility savings, I mentioned just a few moments ago that although some of our costs are considered fixed, we have made efforts to try to control those costs. 2 actions the board has previously voted on. One of those is a new electric rate contract, which will go fully into effect in January of 2019 that will result in savings. And then also the board approved a contract with Synergistic, which is more behavioral-based savings that will be implemented throughout this year, or starting this year and going into the next fiscal year. And between those two, we're hoping to realize about $2.6 million of savings just on utility costs. And additionally, we had targeted reductions of the extra planning period. There were a number of high school campuses, including Marshall, Hightower, Willow Ridge, Missouri City, and Crystal McAuliffe that had additional planning periods. When this was implemented, it was not done across the district level. It was just at those targeted areas. And in working with the assistant superintendents and school leadership at those particular campuses, we've worked to ensure that the core areas that need the most attentions continue to maintain that. But we have made some adjustment to those planning periods so that we have some savings where it's not necessarily directly needed at those particular core content areas. On the bilingual and pre-K consolidation program, there are currently 14 campuses that have bilingual programs. And in some cases, the classroom ratios are below 17:1. And as you're aware, the state requires a 22:1 ratio. We've made efforts to consolidate some of those campuses, going from a total of 14 campuses down to 10. That will result in about $1.3 million in savings that we'll be able to carry forth on an ongoing basis. At the central office level, we've reduced about $2.6 million. And in some areas we had where expenditures, we had a budget, we didn't expend everything that was allocated, and we've made targeted reductions there. So those areas aren't being reduced, they're being adjusted downward. Adjustments to professional services of about $200,000. Professional development of about $500,000, and then a hiring review, which would mean we would evaluate all positions that become open throughout the fiscal year to determine if it's absolutely necessary to fill at that point in time. And between all of those items, we would have about $2.6 million in savings. The final 2 items, the centralization of the educational assistants. The educational assistants are the equivalent of a resident sub on campus. We're going to centralize those to gain some efficiencies, so that that should result in sub-saving costs of about $800,000. And then the final item, there was an assistant principal internship that was created at the beginning of this school year. However, because of the lack of the fundings, we are redirecting those positions back into the classroom. And just as a point of reference, those teachers who opted to participate in that program were paid at the teacher rate, so it's not going to be an adjustment to their salary. They were already on the teacher scale. So based on what we've walked through, again, to walk you through, you can see how each of those goals ties into the total budget that's being submitted at $634.6 million. As it looks walking into the 18-19 budget, we're proposing, or the 2017-18 estimate, you can see that we had initially budgeted about $12 million in economic stabilization. However, we're anticipating only using 1.56 of that, so we should have close to $10 million carrying over that would be available for use next year. For the 18-19 year, we're proposing to use $5.86 million of that remaining economic stabilization that will bring us to a balanced budget, including the use of those funds. So total expenditure or revenues of $626.77 million, operating expenditures of $634.6 million, and that gets us to a point of having $2 million that's coming in again from extended learning with a use of $5.86 million in economic stabilization. For our fund balance history, this is a brief overview of how that would pair out. As you can see, the most important component here is the very bottom line in the lower left. In both 2017 and 17-18 and 2018-19, we do anticipate meeting fund balance requirements that have been established by the board, where we would have 90 days in operating expenditures available, which is an equivalent to 25% of our total operating expenditures. And I will point out quickly on the committed fund balance, we will be bringing to the board at the next board meeting the fund balance resolution for how those funds would be specifically allocated for the upcoming fiscal year. We've also prepared a 3-year outlook for how things look, and what I would say is that this is an idea to give you an idea of how things could progress. It's not necessarily an indication of how things will progress, but as we've looked beyond 2018-19, we're using a 3% growth rate each year for property taxes. We're assuming no changes to state funding formulas, and that we do not receive any additional Harvey-related reimbursements. Now, we recognize that we probably will, but in terms of what we're building here, it's just to show you how things would progress if things were exactly as they are today. On the expenditure side, we're assuming the opening of the Reese CTE Center and Elementary 51 in the fall of 2019, and we're projecting for the new teaching staff that would be needed to manage the new student growth. The final note is that we've included assumptions for compensation adjustment. The teacher step is maintained, as well as a general pay increase of 2% of each year, and we are not recommending a general increase this year, as you're aware, but we're recognizing that our surrounding districts are including those projections for compensation adjustments in their forecast. So as you've seen some of the deficits from our surrounding districts, that's because they have rolled those numbers in there, and we felt to be on a parity in terms of providing accurate information, we should include those as well. So as you look at this does have a significant impact on our overall outlook. So based on the factors discussed on the previous slide, we would be balanced in 2018-19. However, we would have a deficit of just over $23 million in 2019-20 if we were to move forward with a 2% general pay increase, and there are no changes to the state funding, which we're not anticipating. Again, it includes the elementary campus as well as the CTE Center. And then moving into 2021, we would see an increase of that deficit to $32 million. And again, this also includes a subsequent 2% increase in that. There are factors that we can control in the forecast, such as how we handle the compensation changes, but the growth in students will continue to add some marginal state revenue. But as we've seen in the past, we've seen that state revenue decline over successive years, and we don't anticipate that that would change going into 19-20. The assumptions that we have are based on the again, what we expect the state to do, and we don't have a good pulse on what could happen there. And then I would say that this may look like an alarming forecast, but the thing that I would say is that we would not bring a budget to the board that was not balanced according to policy. So although we're presenting this to you, this is how things would look if we were to do the implementation of a general pay increase, as well as see no additional growth and revenue beyond the 3% revaluation that we're currently expecting. So again, what we would bring forward as a future budget for both 19 and 20 and 2021 is a budget that complies with the directive of the board to have a 90-day fund balance requirement. So this would not be ultimately what you would see. Moving to the Child Nutrition Fund, it's expected to end the year with a deficit of about $600,000. As we previously shared, there were 12 operating days that were lost due to bad weather throughout the year, including Harvey and a winter chill that we weren't expecting. And that resulted in a loss of revenue of about $1.5 million. However, the fund is expected to end the year with $3.62 million. And as we're looking into next year, revenues and expenditures are estimated at just under $30 million. And there are no changes recommended to the rates that students pay for meals. And with that, those assumptions, our fund balance would remain unchanged going into 1920. For the debt service fund, our year-end estimate includes $100 million in additional expenditures for new commercial paper that's been issued. Additionally, other sources is $90 million higher, and this is related to the refunding done in May for the 2008 bond series. Overall, the fund balance is expected to be drawn down by about $190,000. Moving into 18-19, the estimated revenues are $99.5 million. Of that, $97.8 million is from property taxes and is based on a tax rate of $1.06, which is unchanged from the current year. And the proposed expenditures of $91.24 million are to service the principal and interest on the district's outstanding debt. I mentioned just a few moments ago the tax rate. The tax rate needed to support the 2018-19 budget is unchanged from the prior year. We expect it to remain at $1.32. And based on the average market value of a home, that will result in about a 2.59% increase to the average tax bill. And again, this is an average, not necessarily what an individual taxpayer would see. But the average tax bill would increase from about $3,283 to $3,367, or about $85 annually. The final component that I have as part of the presentation is when you compare the district's tax rate to 24 other local districts, we have the fourth lowest tax rate at $1.32. And taken into consideration with the information from the Texas Smart Schools on student achievement, I believe that it illustrates that we are prudent in the way that we manage taxpayer resources. The final items that I have are the upcoming actions that would be taken in June, which the following meeting this week would be subsequent to this week would be the budget adoption. We also will have the final budget amendment and the fund balance resolution. Moving into July, that will be when we receive the certified tax roll. August, we'll make the Chapter 41 choice selection, and then finally in September, we will finalize the budget, I guess you could say, with the official adoption of the tax rate. And that concludes the presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunn. Do we have any questions from the board members? Mr. Rice?
Thank you, Madam Vice President, and thank you, Mr. Gunn, for a very excellent presentation, as always. In going through this budget, I'm just going to repeat what I heard you tell me, and I have some questions. On page 4 of your presentation, I'm understanding you to say that the CPT value growth is determined by Glenn Hagar, the state controller.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And so that is what they look at when they're getting ready to write us a check.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
So they're going to say, even though we say our property value growth is 3% this year, I think it was 5% last year. When they get ready to write us a check, they look back and they calculate what a 6.8% bump in the appraised value is, and then they, whatever that is, they short our check by a corresponding amount. Is that right?
That is correct. The CPTD, when the district's value goes down and the CPTD is higher, we do see a resulting decrease in state revenue when that occurs. And we are in that situation going into the 18-19 school year.
So last year we had an $18 million reduction in state funding. How much, and that's because they looked, the previous year we had an 11% bump in our appraised value, and then that dropped to 5%. So what is, do you know what 6.8% is worth roughly?
Is it 3? 11 million? It's roughly 11 million. $11
million.
Yes.
So when the state says they're giving us all the money they need, they're really using the revenue from local property taxes to supplant other things, and that's money they don't have to send us. So they don't have to send us $11 million this year because of this CPTD growth.
I would say you have editorialized that very well. I would say as a bureaucrat, I would respond that the way that they have established the state funding formula, the way you have described it, is how it works.
Yes. And we know it's not a state property tax because the Supreme Court has ruled that it's not, and they're never wrong, but it sure feels like one. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you, it seems like it wasn't that long ago, the percentage of students on free and reduced lunch were 38%, and now I see it's 43%. So it's increasing.
That is correct, yes, sir.
So as Fort Bend ISD becomes more urban, the number of free and reduced students is growing, percentage-wise.
That would be the appearance. However, I would also mention that over the last year and a half, particularly the last 18 months, or the last 2 years, but in the last 18 months, we have had a very concentrated effort on identifying students who are eligible for that benefit. So somewhat similar to our special education population, we likely had students that were previously eligible for it but not taking advantage of the benefit, and now we've identified those students, so we feel like that's also a component of that increase.
Very well. And you have included teacher step increases, which are roughly $500 per teacher.
Yes, sir.
But you're not including a pay raise. Is that right?
That is correct. There is no general pay increase for teachers or for other staff that are not teachers.
The other thing, Mr. Gunn, if you turn to page 5, our proposed budget by functional area for instruction. Now, the instructional piece here, did I understand you to say is for teachers and principals or just teachers?
The instructional area, which is function 11, 12, and 13, includes components of both. It's the instructional. Let me flip over to, I went the wrong way. This gives you a better idea of the breakdown. So the instructional area includes teachers. The instructional leadership, which is function 21, is where the principals are. That's the instructional support. But we're looking at those combined since the principals and the teachers are together on campus.
Okay. But if I take instructional, which is function 11, 12, and 13, that's for instruction. That means classroom teachers. That means instructional resources media. Does that mean books?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And librarians.
And library and curriculum development. People preparing the curriculum to meet the new STAR requirements every year. So if I take $389 million and divide it by $634 million, it looks to me like that percentage is 61% of our budget. And so if I was talking to someone, maybe a state legislature, for example, who claimed that we only put 40% of our resources into the classroom, I mean, that would be a patently false statement, as I understand it. Is my math correct?
I believe that your math is correct based on the statement that you made. Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I believe it is too, and I believe my statement is correct as well. And I'm not going to put you in a box, but I want everyone to know that contrary to what some have said, we don't put only 40% of our resources into the classroom. We're putting 61%, and that is for teachers, and that is for books and a library, and that's for curriculum. Now, on top of that, even if I polled members of the Texas legislature, I don't think I would get anybody who would be opposed to having a school principal or a nurse or a counselor or a librarian or other things like that. That's in instructional support, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I'm just trying to get it fixed in my mind, so if someone asks me that question, I'll be able to explain to them and help them try to understand. All right. Thank you for that question. I was also pleased to see that, we are all very concerned about school safety. And although we have a very good school police department, I think it goes beyond that, and we need to have good counselors. We need to have folks who can intervene when they see aberrant behavior, and we need to try to help our kids when they're suffering. And so I'm glad to see that that's still included in there. Social workers, Fort Bend County truancy, licensed what are they? School psychologists. Okay. And then on district operations, can you tell me, well, I recall in 2010, our annual utility bill was approximately $15 million. Do you know what it is today? I believe it's gone down.
It has gone down. What we have budgeted for next year, including the savings, is about $12.4 million.
Including the savings.
That's correct.
So we've got behavior modifications such as don't forget to turn out the lights when you leave the classroom. And so if I look, I know you said that you weren't going to bring us a budget, which was, when you said it was a little frightening, and I agree with that. Where was it? It showed the 19. Okay, in 2019-20, a surplus deficit of $23 million. I know you said you wouldn't bring us a budget like that. We'd have to find ways to make some other cuts. But in 2010, people said to me, because we had a $28 million shortfall then, and they asked me if we could have a bake sale or if we could have a car wash to help reduce that deficit. And I replied, yes, but if we turned off the lights and the air conditioning at every facility that we own for an entire year, back then when it was $15 million, we'd still be $13 million short. And so under your forecast for 2019-20, unless we do some other things, 23 to 12 million. If we did the same thing, we'd still be $11 million short.
So if I understand what you're saying if we turned off all the lights and stopped running the air conditioner, we would be still $11 million in the hole. Yeah. That is a correct statement.
Which is just, obviously, we wouldn't do anything like that. But I'm pointing that out to try to put the order of magnitude up there for everybody to easily understand. The next item on page 13, you have the Texas Smart Schools. And I believe that Glenn Hagar also has a school assessment tool, and I don't recall what it's called. It might be the SMART goal. Do you recall, Mr. Bassett? Well, we win it every year because...
First. Is it the first?
First.
Oh, yes, school first, and we do a briefing on that annually
which is essentially the same thing. It measures the student academic achievement as compared to our total expenditures, which is exactly what this is doing as well. And we always come out very well because we have very, very low costs, and our students are achieving high academic results, more or less. And so I'd like to point that out because sometimes people ask me, or people tell me, Jim, the school district has got to be more efficient. And I ask them, why would you say that? What makes you think we're not efficient? And so, Mr. Gunn, would you say that you've scrubbed this budget pretty hard?
I would say based on the current financial situation that we are in, we have made every effort to be as efficient as we possibly can with the dollars that we're being given by the taxpayer.
So it's a pretty efficient budget.
That would be a yes, sir.
And when I look at the tax rate of something like 20 different school districts around here, we're one of the lowest.
The fourth lowest.
Fourth
to
lowest.
Be specific.
Okay. On page 16, we have the use of our Economic Stabilization Fund. And if I understood you correctly, in 2016, we didn't use it. In 2017, we had budgeted almost $12 million, but you found ways to reduce that, so we only spent 1.56.
That is correct. And I'd like to add to that, if I may, that in 2016, the board had the foresight to set that funding aside so that it would be available in a situation like this. And fortunately, the way that we've managed to budget and manage the budget throughout the fiscal year, we are able to have some left aside that would allow us to continue into 18-19 to further use that funding.
5.86 and 18-19. So combined, we're going to be a little bit over $7 million. Does that mean we'll have about $4 million still left over for 19-20?
What I would say to that is that depends on how we end the upcoming year. Because, of course, as we go into next year, depending on what our total expenditures are, there could be a portion of that would have to be allocated to the 90-day fund balance reserve. But at this point, the answer to your question is yes, it is. As it stands now, yes, it would be available.
And so this budget, as you pointed out, still includes a 90-day reserve, which is per board policy, and you've done your best to adhere to that, and we do appreciate that. And lastly, on page 18, the teacher step increases are included in this budget. The general, this is your 3-year outlook assumption.
Yes, sir.
You have included 2% general pay increases each year beginning in 1920 for illustration purposes.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And so our teachers deserve a raise. They work really hard, but this shows us it's at the current rate, all things being equal, everything based on today, that would place us in an untenable situation.
Yes, sir, that is correct.
We've got more homework to do. I do appreciate your patience and answering these questions, and I think you've done a very good job on this. Oh, one last thing. When I look at when I compare our M&O budget with our debt service budget, I think it clearly illustrates the fact that the debt service budget doesn't have the same clawback from the state that we've talked about on the M&O side, which is why we have a hefty fund balance in there. And so I would just like everybody to realize that, and every time we have a budget briefing and then we adopt the tax rate, we always have citizens come here to complain that we're not lowering the effective tax rate. We haven't changed the tax rate itself, but as the value of the appraised district increases, the effective tax rate also increases, which you've clearly pointed out. But we can't reduce that rate because the state is subtracting from us every year whatever the growth and value of the appraised value is. One last question, and I'll be quiet. what happens when we reach equilibrium? Theoretically, if we ever reach equilibrium, would the state ever wind up increasing its contribution to the school district?
I mean, that certainly could happen, but we'll have to see what happens with the upcoming session.
I mean, I know what happens as if the CAT appraised value increased every year, which it won't, but hypothetically, we would reach a point where the state wasn't contributing one thin dime to Fort Bend ISD. And we know that won't happen in real life, but hypothetically it could. So my question is, if it was going the other way, what would the state do?
So whenever our property value does grow at a higher rate than the CP2D value, that means we get the benefit of that local value for a year from that additional amount. And then the state waits a year before they claw some of that back. So we do get a one-time benefit to help us with some of our one-time expenses.
Yeah, but what if our property values were declining in value?
If our property values decline in value, and depending on what happens with the state in the prior year, I don't. If they do go down, yes, the state does kick in more, and that did happen in the 2008-2009 years, whenever we did have a reduction in our overall property value.
But we still had a $28 million deficit in 2010.
Yes, sir, and that was because of the loss in state revenue overall from sales tax.
Okay. Well, one final question, Mr. Gunn. What is the Chapter 41 choice selection? What does that mean? That's on slide 24.
The Chapter 41 choice selection is it's an election that we have, or an option that we have to select every year to buy down our tenants, basically our wealth, and it's a WADA calculation.
Okay, I may have to ask you a question about that later.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Gunn.
Thank you, Jim. I just want to, before we move forward with the next board member, to apologize to Mr. Quinn for pronouncing his name incorrectly. Thanks. KP?
Thank you, Ms. Halliger. Yeah, I have a few questions. The first one is, you mentioned even though we have budget shortfall, we are not cutting any instructional staff, or teachers. But I see that there are, specialized programs like GT. There are, I heard, I don't even know it is true, but is that true? We are cutting positions in that area, specialized teachers.
So the short answer to that is when we put together the budget yet this year, we have made no reductions to staffing. In some cases, as I mentioned earlier, such as with the assistant principal interns, those positions were redirected back into the classroom. So any positions that are associated with specialized programs shouldn't necessarily be seeing a reduction unless a campus chose to offer different course selections that would have impacted that. But to my knowledge, the answer to that question would be no, we're not making reductions to any specific programs from a staffing perspective.
Okay, but why this understanding out there? People are talking about the staff position is being cut. I really don't know. Maybe you don't know either. But
that would be my comment. But at least from my perspective, the staffing allocations that we've made would not have necessarily directly impacted that.
Okay, and also during that presentation, I don't know which page it is. You mentioned the regular teachers versus a separate item for fine art instruction. Can you please explain what does that exactly mean?
So the classroom teachers, what I did is, or what I should say, what we did on this is we're looking at the classroom teachers, but we specifically did not include fine arts since they have their own programmatic side. So the fine arts teaching staff that are included here are those that are teaching directly to the curriculum and within Fort Bend ISD. So the $25.56 million that you see there could be considered part of classroom instructional as well, but we broke it out separately so you could see what expenditures are specific for fine arts.
Okay. And the next question I have is the assistant principal intern program, which is, I thought it was an amazing step to develop our own, leaders in our district. So what was the reason, or I understand we have to cut, but why did we specifically pick to that item? Any details on it?
Let me take that, Brian. So we did a very collaborative process with all of our leaders and also with the Budget Compensation Committee to pick things to cut, and that was one of the items that was high on the list of that was suggested by those two groups.
Is that because they feel it is not valuable, or?
I mean, not necessarily. Everything that we were spending money on the year before was valuable, or else we wouldn't be spending money on it. It was just a matter of making difficult decisions and trying to prioritize things.
Okay. And also there's another one item I have. Can you give me an update or a status on the program Naviance? Are we still using it, or what is the status on that?
We are still using Naviance.
Yes, sir.
And we are tracking the progress of each campus. Student usage, right now we can report that every campus has a student usage over 80%, some well over 90%. We can provide a report to the board as to student usage this year and which goals were met.
Okay, thank you. And going to page number 14, the budget reduction items. Item number 2, there's targeted reduction on extra planning periods. How that is going to impact the teacher planning and things of that nature, because I always hear, teachers always like to have more time for planning and things of that nature. So how have you ever considered what kind of impact it's going to have on teachers?
Yeah, so this was something that we talked about with the assistant superintendents. So when it had been implemented in 2014-15, those at-risk campuses were given, all of the core teachers were given two planning periods. So they were teaching 5 out of 7. And what we had seen over time is that because some of the other campuses that were also at risk did not receive that allocation, we didn't feel like all of that was needed. So there wasn't a reduction for the whole thing. It was a reduction of about 40% of that total amount. And so we worked with the assistant superintendents to make sure that the areas where they felt like they had the greatest need would still be covered with those additional planning periods so they could have the collaboration.
So when we take away this or reduce this, are we doing it based on the campus needs, or are we looking at because some campuses need that more than other campuses?
Yeah, it wasn't done blanket like X% per campus. It was done with each campus with the specific needs in mind.
Right. Some campuses need more help, and that kind of situation we are considering. We have taken that into consideration when we decided to reduce that item.
Yes, sir.
Correct? Okay. And one last thing I have is page number 16, the economic stabilization fund. What is our total? Is that a total amount we have in that?
When we initially set this aside, we set aside specifically $14 million in economic stabilization. For the 17-18 school year, the board authorized us to use up to $12 million of that $14 million.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. And it's a very good presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. George. Do we have any more questions from the board members? Oh, Mrs. Grail.
Thank you, Ms. Helger. So just sticking right on that slide right there, the Economic Stabilization Fund is not part of our fund balance. Is that correct?
That is correct. It was over and above what was set aside in the 90 days.
Okay, so thank you for that clarification. So I just wanted to thank you for an excellent presentation. I really appreciate how you guys work to break the budget down by goal so that we could see how our dollars were working towards achieving our goals. I think that's really impactful, and I appreciate the art of budget creation that you exercised using, both sides of your brain. So I appreciate that. But I do have something that I'm not totally understanding, and that's on the next slide, actually. the fund balance numbers, I know, as Mr. Rice mentioned earlier, it's important. I believe it's important for us to have 90 days fund balance, but I'm not understanding how we could have less money in the fund balance and still have 90 days. And I tried to do a little bit of math, and the numbers didn't really work out for me. So is that something that you can explain, or
I can make
a chart?
Brief attempt of that, but it may be easier in a memo. So what I would say is what we do is when we calculate the fund balance requirement, we're looking at the total operating expenditures. So we would take 25% of that number, and that would become the amount that we would need to set aside for our 90-day reserve. When we look at our 90-day reserve, it's broken down into 3 pots. The first is committed fund balance, which will bring forward a resolution to the board at the next board meeting where you will specify what that committed fund balance is. Then we could move to the state revenue stabilization, which is, I believe, 30 days. State revenue stabilization is 30 days operating. That's a minimum. It's the combination of the state revenue stabilization and unassigned fund balance that make up the 90 days. So what we are looking for is a number that is greater than the 25% of our operating expenditures to get to 90 days. Did that make sense?
It did. I think, yes, it did. And I think I just need to do a little bit more math to figure out it, because I see the delta there on the committed fund balance numbers, and that number, that 21.4 right now, is an estimate, and that's to be determined.
Right, and essentially what we are looking for is for the 52.9 and the $103.5 million to total what's available for our 90-day reserve. So in this particular case, we are meeting that requirement.
Okay, all right. Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And then if we go just to the 3-year outlook page, which is, I think, page 19. So I appreciate you guys showing the 3-year outlook, because I think that's helpful to us to understand what the path forward is. And I would say that, as Mr. Rice, I think, mentioned, this is a stark reality of our situation, that our school district is facing financial wall, essentially. We're facing a real struggle. And how we are going to reconcile $23 million when we have, I believe you said, close to 90% in salaries and benefits, that's really quite a mountain to climb. So I think, Mr. Bassett, you mentioned the committee that was working on the budget reductions, and I appreciate all of their time and effort, and you guys facilitating that process. But I think I'm beginning to believe that just cutting back in some areas is not going to be enough, and it's going to come to prioritizing and choosing things that we choose to continue versus things that we need to choose to stop doing. Because the train, there's no path where the state funding and our situation are going to meet. I mean, I just don't see that happening in the short term. So I realize, and I'm just mentioning that because I think we need to realize as a board the difficult decisions that are ahead of us. And it's that slide to me shows it very clearly. So thank you. I guess that was more of a comment than it was a question. You mentioned about a general pay increase, that the 2021 year included a 2% general pay increase. Can you give us an approximate dollar amount that is? Each 1% is about $5.6 million. About $5.6 million. So between those two, it'd be roughly $11 million for 2% each year. And then, of course, when you move into the second year, you're compounding on top of the 2% you gave the prior year. Right. I see that. So if we put 2% in there and we subtract 11.2, then we're still looking at a $12 million deficit even without a raise, which I know our staff works very hard, and so that would be very unfortunate to have to go 2 years in a row. Okay, and then I had one other question. You used a number for cost per pupil, and one number on the SMART chart was something, and then at the very beginning of the slides you showed us on page 3, I marked down, you showed us a different number.
So how do we reconcile those?
Yes.
I'm thinking as the question is going to be, and my response to that would be we can't, because those numbers from the Texas SMART are calculated by a different organization.
Okay.
The number that we've calculated, we can definitely tie down to, but based on the way that they've done it, one of the things that I would point out on that, if you look at their information, they call it an adjusted spending per pupil. And they have, I'm sure, some type of algorithm that they use to get to that. Unfortunately, when you read through their methodology, they don't publish what that is, so we don't have an exact way of getting back to their number.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's the end of my question.
Thank you, Mrs. Jane. Mr. Rosenthal?
Yes, thank you. That was actually one of my questions, was what does cost adjusted mean? But I guess never mind. But so I just want to piggyback on what Ms. James was just speaking about prior to that. So as we're going to see later, we're going to be talking about programming and whatnot to try to bring more utilization to our undercapacity schools throughout the district. And so I guess every time we hear bringing programs or new programs, it means more money. And I know we can always cut back on programs, but it's very rare that government programs go away. So we need to be mindful of that. And then I guess there's going to be some kind of balance, right? As you bring students back to the district, obviously you're receiving more revenue. So I guess you have to, there'll be some type of balance between the cost of programming and revenues generated from that programming. So I imagine that'll be pretty difficult to forecast without having some kind of go-by or seeing something in other districts where they've brought in a program and they've brought in this many more students or students back to their district. So something to consider.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Thank you, Mr. Quinn. At this time, we'll ask for any questions from the audience around the budget only. All right. Well, that concludes. Okay. Around the budget only. Okay.
Okay, Hui Chen. My question is on the student enrollment, the proportional increase. Is it proportionate to the budget that's been placed? And someone mentioned about the Zoom, like the school capacity. And I noticed now evenly distributed, so it's on the budget. Say, for example, the student enrollment is more than 3% increase. And if the budget is only accountable for 3% increase, is it a good budget or not?
Okay, I believe your question is with the student enrollment projected to be a 3% increase, does our budget take into consideration that increase? Did I get it right? Okay, thank you.
Our enrollment, I don't have the percentage handy, but I know it's well less than 3% overall. Do you have that?
Well, what I was going to say is even though the student enrollment may increase, we don't necessarily receive proportionate funding to that increase. So as state revenue declines and local revenue increases, a portion will be offset by the local portion, but unfortunately, we don't necessarily receive a dollar-for-dollar increase for those new students coming in. So we can't necessarily increase expenditures proportionate to enrollment.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, I want to clarify that.
Mr. Tassan.
So I just had a comment. So we're showing a projected 75,909 on page 3. So I just wanted to point that out. And right now we're at a little over 75,000. So that's less than 1,000 students increase next year. So that's nowhere close to 3%. The 3% increase that was shown on these slides is for the property value growth. So I just wanted to clarify that because I didn't know if that was confusing the way that was. But we're looking at less than 1,000 students in growth next year.
That is correct. I believe it calculates if you go from the October PEAM shot from 2017 until now, it's about 634 students.
Right. And that's the moderate, we're taking the moderate growth projection.
From our demographer, yes, it is.
So it could be more, it could be less, but that's the number that we're using. So about 600 students is what you said, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenthal?
So I'd like to just follow up on that question and your answer. So just to clarify, so let's, what does the state typically give us per average or per student?
Roughly $5,700.
So 50. So in other words, if we gain one student, you're saying that we don't necessarily get to capture that complete 5,700.
Because it would go through the state funding formula, et cetera. How much has our local revenue growth? We get the per capita allotment of 5,700, but as it goes through the formula, it may not necessarily materialize as 5,700.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to clarify that so everybody kind of understands. So thank you for that.
I believe that our former governor, George Bush, referred to it as fuzzy math, and this may be applicable in this situation.
And nobody can explain it.
Mr. Bassett can explain it.
Bet he can't.
All right, thank you all.
He knows most of it.
It's getting late. Okay, if we don't have any other questions, at this time I ask for an adjournment. Make a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay. Thank you. At this time, we'll ask the board members to stay in place for 2 minutes, and our president will join us by conference call. There you go. All right.